Okay, welcome to lesson 1.3, ordering real numbers. The essential question here is, how do you order a set of real numbers? So remember what real numbers are. They're numbers such as 10, -12, 1/2, the square root of 16, which by the way is actually 4, and the square root of 12, which is a decimal, pi, which is a decimal. So both the square root of 12 and pi are irrational numbers, but they are included in the set of real numbers. That means that there's no pattern. They're a decimal that never ends. And so you're going to learn how to order these from low to high. Okay, so we're on page 21. It says comparing irrational numbers. So keep in mind that irrational numbers are decimals that are never ending. There's no repeating to them. I pointed out some types of irrational numbers on the first slide. So we'll be ordering irrational numbers. And they choose irrational numbers because when you have a number inside the radical symbol that's not a perfect square, you have to estimate what the decimal value is. And most of these, I'm just going to tell you to grab your calculator and figure them out. But a few of these they want you to look at and just kind of approximate what they are. So starting off for problem number 1, compare the square root of 3 plus 5. It's either going to be less than, greater than, or equal to 3 plus the square root of 5. Now, you should be able to logically figure out what the answer is going to be just by looking at the 5 and the 3. You know that the left side is going to be larger than the right side. But let's go through all the steps that they want us to. So use perfect squares to estimate the square roots. Approximate the square root of 3. So the square root of 3 is going to be a decimal, a never-ending decimal. And I'm sorry. So the square root of 1 equals 1. The square root of 2, well, that's going to be a decimal. The square root of 3, that's a decimal. The square root of 4 equals 2. So we know that the square root of 3 falls someplace between a 1 and a 2. It's going to be closer, however, to 2. The square root of 3 is between the square root of 1 and the square root of 4, or between 1 and 2. Approximate the square root of 5. So the square root of 5, we don't know what that is. It's a decimal. The square root of 6, of course, is another decimal. The square root of 7, another decimal. The square root of 8, oh my, another decimal. The square root of 9 is 3. So you can see that the square root of 5 is between the square root of 4 and the square root of 9. It's between 2 and 3, but it's closer to 2. So this is going to be between 2 and 3. It is closer to 2. Use your estimations to simplify the expression. Well, the square root of 3 is closer to 2. So we're going to say that's about a 1. Oops, I don't know where it went. There it is. And 2. So it's between 1 and 2. So it's between 6 and 7. And 3 plus the square root of 5 is between 3 plus 2 and 3 plus 3. Now keep in mind I'm getting these numbers from up here. I'm just transferring them down. So that's going to be between 3 plus 2 is 5. 3 plus 3 is 6. So we can go on to say, so the square root of 3 plus 5 is, what is it, less than, greater than, or equal to the square root of 3 plus 5, and that's going to be, of course, greater than. Yeah, they kind of want you to go through all this to do these problems, but eventually you're going to have to grab your calculator. So let's look at the reflect problems, number 1 and 2. So take a look at the reflect problems and come back. Okay, so number 1, if 7 plus the square root of 5 is equal to 5 plus some unknown number, what do you know about the number? Well, since the square root of 5, the square root of 5 are the same, that makes both sides equal. They're adding, so that keeps both sides equal. So that missing number has to be a 7. So the missing number has to be a 7. Missing number is 7. Okay, because both sides have to be 7 plus the square root of 5, so we're missing a 7 on the right. Number 2, what are the closest two integers that the square root of 300 is between? So this is more of a guess and check kind of thing. So the square root of 100 I know is 10, and the square root of 400 is 20. So I know I'm between 10 and 20. So if I think about what 15 squared is, 15 squared is 225. So I know my answer has to be between 15 and this 20. So just by a matter of elimination, I know it's between 17 and 18. Again, you'll be grabbing your calculator for these, so I wouldn't sweat it out too much. If you figure out the square root of 300, it's between 17 and 18. Okay, as I said before, if you want to use kind of logical thinking to figure this out, here's 4, here's 2. I mean, you may want to figure out, that's not too difficult. The square root of 4, you should know that off the top of your head. So you should get a number answer over here. And this one, you can just kind of logical think of what the answer is going to be. Here you've got definitely have a 6 here and a 12 here. So the question is the square root of 12 going to bump this higher than 12 on the other side? Because this 12 is going to be bumped higher. So think about that for a minute. So try to figure them out. Use a calculator if you need to. I'll be back. Okay, so here we're going to have greater than. And I know that because the square root of 4 is 2, and 2 plus 2 is 4. So the highest the right-hand side can be is 4. Well, this already has 4 plus some other number to it. So even the square root of 2, if it's a really small number, it doesn't make a difference. This left side will definitely be higher than the right-hand side. And just so you know, the square root of 2 is it's approximately 1 4/10. So 1 4/10 plus 4 would give you 5 4/10. So definitely the left-hand side is larger. Okay, on the other side, the square root of 12 the square root of 12 is 3 5/10 approximately. Add that to 6, and you get 9 5/10. You can just use a calculator to find the square root of 12. So this is 9 5/10. Well, this is already 12 on this side. So that's as high as the left side is going to go, is 9 5/10. So you know that the right side is smaller than the left side. And if you want to know what the square root of 6 is, just use your handy dandy calculator. It's about 2 4/10. So add that to 12, and you get 14 4/10, and you can prove that the right side is larger. It all depends on what kind of calculator you have. Most calculators want you to put the square root symbol in first and then put the number in. If you have a question on how your calculator works, just look on the internet, look up your calculator on the internet and ask it, how do I put a square root in, and go for that. Also keep in mind that you should know the square root of 4 equals 2. So just do guess and check on your calculator putting the buttons in. How do you have to put the buttons in? You have to put the 4 in first or the square root first to get an answer of 2. Just give it a try. So moving on. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're going to order the square root of 22, pi plus 1, and 4.5 from least to greatest. Make sure you know what you're going to do. Most times they do have least to greatest, but every once in a while they'll switch these up and they'll want greatest to least. So be careful if you're going to go low to high or backwards, high to low. And this is one that I would tell you right away to use your calculator. You see, they want you to approximate the square root of 22 by taking 4 and 5/10 and squaring it by hand, 4 and 6/10 and squaring it, 4 and 7/10 again squaring it by hand. And when I say squaring it by hand, they mean 4 and 6/10 times 4 and 6/10. Do that long multiplication problem. But I'm just going to tell you to grab your calculator. Now, looking at these answers, 4 and 7/10 squared is closest to 22. It's only over by 9/100ths, whereas 4 and 6/10, that's much too low. So you want to approximate the square root of 22 as 4 and 7/10. Remember the value of pi they want you to use 3 and 14/100ths. So pi plus 1 is simply 4 and 14/100ths. All right, so using that information, they then go down to the number line that they have already plotted. And here's the square root of 22. Remember, it's about 4 and 7/10. And notice how they actually label this with the square root of 22 and not 4 and 7/10. That's what you need to do. You have to label it with the original number. Here's 4.5, which will be 4 and 5/10. Here's pi plus 1, which they decided was 4 and 14/100ths. And so by placing them on the number line, you can tell who's the least and who's the greatest. So the order would be pi plus 1, 4.5, and the largest is the square root of 22. But again, something weird like this, just use your calculator and find the square root of 22. Okay, here's the your turn. So please use your calculators for these. Pi squared, just use your calculator. The square root of 75, just use your calculator. I'll be right back. Okay, so what I did here is I found the square root of 5, which is about 2 and 2/10. The square root of 3, which is 1 and 7/10. Now just looking at these two, they both have the same symbol, the square root. 3 is smaller than 5. So I know that 3 is going to be smaller than 5 when I put them in order from least to greatest. So the square root of 3 is smallest, the square root of 5 is next, and 2 and 5/10 is the largest. Then I also mark them on the number line. Okay, pi squared is about 9 and 9/10. Keep in mind that I'm rounding these off to the nearest tenth to make life easier for me. I'm not using all the decimals. And then we have, of course, 10. The square root of 75 is 8 and 7/10. So the smallest is going to be the square root of 75, then pi squared, and then 10. Now, this thing was giving me a hard time, and I was trying to, it still gave me a hard time, I was trying to plot them on the number line so that you could see them on the number line, and they would not cooperate with me. So let's see, x squared is about 9 and 9/10. And of course you have a 10. and then the square root of 75. That's going to be 8 7/10. It's about here. And that's the square root of 75. So I'm using the original numbers for these. Okie dokie. Okay, so this isn't much different than one we just did. They have 4 people. This is just a real life. And all they're really doing is, rather than just give you 4 numbers, random numbers, they're making a little story up with them. But the idea is you're still going to put them in order from greatest to least. Remember how I said to you sometimes they switch the order? Well, here they did that. Greatest to least. So they want to know the greatest one. So they did is they took the square root of 28 and they decided that its best value was 5 3/10. Again, use your calculator. 23 divided by 4 is 5 75/100. 5 repeating is just 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. And that way you can see that this number is actually smaller than this number, but this 5 5/10 repeating is larger than 5 3/10, therefore larger than square root of 28. And 5 1/2 they convert to a decimal so they can be copied. Now, careful on this one. This one has many 5s. What do you have after this 5? What would be after that 5? Yeah, it would be a 0. So this is like saying $5.50. This is like $5.55. So of course this number is larger than this number. And you can use that information to plot it. So I'm going to try to move this up and see if it works. It did. You can see they plotted them on the number line. So greatest to least, here's the greatest, 23 4/10. Next is 5 5/10 repeating, then 5 1/2, and then the square root of 28. Remember, they want greatest to least. So make sure you read those instructions and you know which way to go. By the way, on that PSSA test that you'll take at the end of the year, they will have one of the choices to be the correct answer. They'll also have another choice, let's say this is choice B, where they have the answer reverse, where they have the answer in least to greatest. And what they're doing here is they're testing to see if you read the instructions correctly. So this would be the least to greatest. Many students would choose B because they did not read the instructions carefully. They want greatest to least, not least to greatest. Your turn is next. Okay, folks, turn these all into decimals. 10 divided by 3, turn it into a decimal. This is 3 4500 repeating. 3 1/2. Make the 1/2 into a decimal. Remember, fractions are fancy division. 1 divided by 2 gives you the decimal. 10 divided by 3 gives you the decimal. Use your calculator to find the square root of 10 and then put them in order. Okay, so what I did here is I took 10 thirds and I just divided 10 by 3. That gives me 3 3300 repeating. Now you may wonder why I use 2 decimal places, because this one has 2 decimal places. And so since this has 2 decimal places, I'm going to use 2 decimal places for all my numbers. So 3 1/2, on the calculator it says 3 5/10, but I want 2 decimal places, so I added a 0. The square root of 10, I went to 2 decimal places. So let's see what the answer is. So they want greatest to least. So the greatest is going to be 3 1/2. That takes this one out. Next is going to be 3 4500. That takes this one out. Then we'll have 3. No, excuse me. I made a mistake, because that's not the number they gave me. I have to put down 10 thirds. That's out. And then find the square root of 10. Okay? Make sure you didn't go least to greatest. This one did say greatest to least. Okay, so you'll find your assignment in My HRW 1.2. And good luck to you. Thanks, guys and gals.